Sarah Mitchell, age 7, disappeared on a crisp October afternoon in 1994 from the small town of Millbrook, Ohio. She was last seen wearing a yellow raincoat with white polka dots, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit as she walked home from elementary school. The distance between Millbrook Elementary and her family's modest two-story house on Elm Street was exactly 4 blocks, a route she had walked hundreds of times before, always arriving home by 3:30 in the afternoon to find her mother baking cookies or folding laundry in the living room. But on October 14, 1994, Sarah never made it home. Her mother, Patricia Mitchell, started to worry at 3:45. By 4 o'clock, she was calling neighbors. By 4:30, she was running through the streets in her slippers, calling Sarah's name until her voice went hoarse. By 5 o'clock, the Millbrook Police Department had initiated a search that would consume the small town of 8,000 residents for weeks, then months, then years. Detective James Holloway was assigned to the case within hours of Sarah's disappearance. At 42 years old, he had been with the Millbrook Police Department for nearly 2 decades, but nothing in his career had prepared him for the desperation in Patricia Mitchell's eyes when she begged him to find her daughter. Sarah was an only child, born after years of fertility struggles. She loved drawing pictures of horses, collected colorful erasers shaped like food items, and wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up. She had a small gap between her front teeth and a constellation of freckles across her nose that darkened in summer. The initial investigation was extensive. Every registered sex offender within a 50-mile radius was interviewed and cleared. Volunteers combed through nearby woods, drainage ditches, and abandoned buildings. Sarah's father, Thomas Mitchell, a manager at the local hardware store, took polygraph tests and passed. Teachers, neighbors, family, friends, everyone who had ever interacted with Sarah was questioned, their alibis verified, their backgrounds checked. But there were no witnesses to Sarah's abduction. No one had seen her after she left the school grounds at 3:15 that afternoon. The yellow raincoat was never found. Neither was the stuffed rabbit. For weeks, the story dominated local news. Sarah's school photograph, showing a smiling girl with brown hair pulled into pigtails, wearing a purple sweater, was plastered on telephone poles, distributed at shopping centers, shown on television broadcasts across 3 states. Then, as winter settled over Millbrook and the ground froze solid, the leads dried up. The search parties dwindled. The news crews packed their equipment and moved on to other stories. The Mitchells kept Sarah's room exactly as she had left it, her bed made, her erasers arranged by color on her desk, hopping against hope that she would walk through the front door one day and everything would return to normal. Detective Holloway never stopped working the case, even as other investigations demanded his attention. He kept Sarah's file on his desk, reviewing witness statements and timelines during his lunch breaks, calling in favors to have evidence re-examined with newer technology as it became available. But as years turned into decades, even Holloway had to admit that the trail had gone completely cold. Patricia Mitchell died in 2008 from complications related to diabetes, but those who knew her well understood that she had really died of a broken heart 14 years earlier. Thomas Mitchell sold the house on Elm Street and moved to Florida, unable to bear living in a town where every street corner reminded him of his missing daughter. The case remained officially open, but in practical terms, it had been relegated to the cold case files, one of those heartbreaking mysteries that haunt small communities for generations. Detective Holloway retired in 2012 at the age of 60, but he took copies of Sarah Mitchell's case files home with him. On quiet evenings, he would sit in his study and review them, still searching for the detail he might have missed, the connection he failed to make. His wife, Ellen, would sometimes find him asleep at his desk, Sarah's photograph visible among the scattered papers. In 2016, Millbrook hired a new detective named Rachel Torres. At 31, she was young, ambitious, and had a reputation for approaching old cases with fresh perspectives. During her first month on the job, she requested access to all unsolved cases from the past 30 years. The Sarah Mitchell file was one of the first she pulled. Torres spent weeks digitizing the old reports, creating spreadsheets of witness statements, mapping out timelines on her computer. She contacted Detective Holloway, now 70 years old, and the two began meeting regularly at a coffee shop downtown. Holloway appreciated her dedication, though he worried that she was setting herself up for the same heartbreak he had carried for 2 decades. What Torres noticed, however, was something that had been overlooked in the initial investigation, not because of negligence, but because the technology to make the connection simply hadn't existed in 1994. Among the dozens of people interviewed in the weeks after Sarah's disappearance was a substitute teacher named Michael Brennan, who had worked at Millbrook Elementary for 3 days in early October, filling in for a teacher who had the flu. Brennan, then 34 years old, had been interviewed briefly because he had been at the school on the day Sarah disappeared. He had an alibi. He had stopped at a gas station after leaving the school and kept the receipt, which showed a time stamp of 3:45 p.m. Security footage from the gas station, grainy and degraded even in 1994, showed a man matching Brennan's description purchasing coffee at that time. He had been cooperative with investigators, expressing sympathy for the Mitchell family. Nothing about him had raised red flags. But Torres discovered something the original investigators couldn't have known. In 2003, Michael Brennan had been arrested in Pennsylvania for attempting to lure a child into his vehicle. He had served 3 years in prison and was registered as a sex offender. Then, in 2011, he had been questioned but not charged in connection with the disappearance of a 9-year-old girl in West Virginia. The girl had eventually been found safe, having run away from home, but Brennan's proximity to the case had been noted. Torres felt her pulse quicken as she read through these later reports. The man who had seemed so innocuous in 1994 had revealed himself to be exactly the type of predator who might abscond with a 7-year-old girl. She immediately began trying to locate Brennan's current whereabouts. It took 2 weeks of searching through databases and making phone calls, but Torres eventually found him. Michael Brennan, now 64 years old, was living in a small apartment in Columbus, Ohio, working as a maintenance man at a shopping plaza. He was still registered as a sex offender, still required to check in with authorities regularly, but he had maintained a low profile since his release from prison in 2006. Torres approached her captain about reopening the Sarah Mitchell investigation with Brennan as a person of interest. The captain was skeptical. After all, Brennan had been cleared in 1994, and there was no new evidence directly connecting him to Sarah's disappearance. But Torres was persistent, arguing that the pattern of behavior Brennan had demonstrated in the years since made him worth a second look. In January 2017, Torres and another detective drove to Columbus to interview Brennan. They found him at his apartment, a modest 1-bedroom unit in a complex that had seen better days. Brennan answered the door in a flannel shirt and jeans, his hair gray and thinning, his face weathered by decades of hard living. When Torres mentioned Sarah Mitchell's name, something flickered in Brennan's eyes, just for a moment, but Torres caught it. He claimed to barely remember the case, saying it had been so long ago and he had only worked at the school for a few days. He maintained that he had told the police everything he knew back in 1994. Torres spent 2 hours interviewing him, asking questions about his time at Millbrook Elementary, about his route home from school that day, about whether he had noticed anything unusual. Brennan remained calm, almost bored, repeating that he had already answered these questions 23 years ago. But as Torres was preparing to leave, she asked one final question. Did you keep the gas station receipt all these years, or did investigators just verify it in 1994? Brennan paused, then said he didn't remember, it had been so long ago. Torres thanked him for his time and left, but her instincts told her that Brennan was hiding something. The problem was that instincts weren't enough. She needed evidence. Back in Millbrook, Torres requested that all physical evidence from the Sarah Mitchell case be retrieved from storage. Among the items were several pieces of trace evidence that had been collected, but never fully analyzed due to the limitations of 1994 technology, including fibers found on the fence of a property 2 blocks from Sarah's school. The property belonged to an elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson who had passed away in 2001. At the time of Sarah's disappearance, she had reported nothing unusual, but investigators had checked her yard as part of their comprehensive search. The fibers had been found caught on a loose nail in her back fence, a fence that bordered an alley that could serve as an alternate route between the school and the Mitchell house. Torres sent the fibers to the state crime lab with a request for the most advanced analysis available. She also requested that they compare any findings to fibers from Michael Brennan's 1994 vehicle, a blue sedan that had been briefly examined during the initial investigation and then released. Weeks passed with no news. Torres continued working other cases, but Sarah Mitchell's file was never far from her mind. She visited James Holloway regularly, updating him on her progress or lack thereof. The old detective's health was declining. He moved slowly now, his hands trembled and his memory sometimes failed him, but his eyes still sharpened whenever they discussed Sarah. In March 2017, Torres received a call from the crime lab. The analyst told her that the fibers from Mrs. Henderson's fence were automotive carpet fibers, consistent with those used in many vehicles manufactured in the early 1990s. More significantly, when compared to samples from Brennan's 1994 sedan, they were a match, same color, same composition, same weave pattern. It wasn't conclusive proof by itself. Thousands of vehicles had similar carpeting, but it placed Brennan's vehicle in an alley along a route Sarah could have taken home, and it contradicted his statement that he had driven straight from the school to the gas station. Torres immediately sought a warrant to search Brennan's current residence and any storage units he might have. The warrant was granted, and on March 28, 2017, a team of investigators descended on Brennan's Columbus apartment. What they found in a locked storage unit, Brennan rented under a false name, would break the case wide open. Among boxes of old clothes and forgotten possessions was a large plastic bin, sealed with duct tape. Inside were items that made Torres' blood run cold: a child's yellow raincoat with white polka dots, a stuffed rabbit with matted fur, and a small collection of drawings, horses, drawn in crayon by a child's hand. Also in the bin were photographs, dozens of them, dating from the 1980s through the early 2000s, showing children in various locations: parks, schools, shopping centers. Some of the children were identifiable as missing persons from unsolved cases across 3 states. But it was what else they found in the storage unit that provided the final, devastating piece of evidence. Buried beneath the bin, wrapped in a tarp, were human remains, small skeletal remains that would later be identified through dental records as Sarah Mitchell. Michael Brennan was arrested on the spot. He refused to speak to investigators without an attorney present, maintaining his silence even as the evidence against him mounted. Forensic analysis of the remains determined that Sarah had died within hours of her abduction, likely from asphyxiation. The manner of her death suggested she had been kept in a confined space, possibly the trunk of Brennan's vehicle, long enough for the lack of oxygen to kill her. The timeline investigators reconstructed was heartbreaking. On October 14, 1994, Brennan had indeed left the school at his usual time, but instead of driving directly to the gas station, he had spotted Sarah walking home alone. He had followed her, offered her a ride, possibly claiming he was running an errand for her teacher or her mother, and Sarah, trusting as children often are toward adults associated with their school, had gotten into his car. Brennan had driven to the alley behind Mrs. Henderson's property, a secluded spot where he could park without being easily seen from the street. There, he had forced Sarah into the trunk of his vehicle. The fibers on Mrs. Henderson's fence had likely transferred when Sarah, already in the trunk, had kicked against the carpet while the car was backed up close to the fence. From there, Brennan had driven to the gas station, establishing his alibi with the time-stamped receipt, while Sarah slowly suffocated in the trunk of his car. By the time he returned to his home later that evening, she was already dead. Rather than panic, Brennan had kept Sarah's body hidden for weeks, eventually burying her in a remote location that investigators would spend months trying to identify. At some point, the exact timeline remained unclear. He had moved her remains to the storage unit, along with her belongings and the photographs of other children he had stalked or worse. The revelation of Sarah Mitchell's fate and the arrest of her killer sent shockwaves through Millbrook. The community that had spent 23 years wondering what had happened to the little girl in the yellow raincoat finally had its answer, though it was not the answer anyone had hoped for. News of the arrest reached Thomas Mitchell in Florida. Now 71 years old, he broke down when Detective Torres called to tell him they had found Sarah. He had never remarried after Patricia's death, had never moved on from the grief of losing his daughter. He told Torres that while he had always feared the worst, some part of him had held on to hope that Sarah might still be alive somewhere, that she had somehow survived and would come home. The confirmation of her death was devastating, but it also brought a strange sense of closure. After more than 2 decades of not knowing, he finally had answers. James Holloway was in his study when Torres came to tell him in person. The old detective listened silently as she explained how the case had been solved, how the evidence had come together, how Sarah had been found. When Torres finished, Holloway sat quietly for several minutes, tears streaming down his weathered face. Then he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the photograph of Sarah Mitchell that he had carried with him for 23 years, the school picture showing a smiling girl in a purple sweater. "I never stopped looking for you," he whispered to the photograph. "I never forgot you." Holloway passed away 6 months later, in September 2017. His family said he had seemed more at peace in those final months than he had been in years, knowing that Sarah's case had finally been solved and her killer would face justice. Michael Brennan's trial began in May 2018. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The physical items found in his storage unit, the forensic analysis of the fibers, Sarah's remains, the photographs of other potential victims. His defense attorney attempted to argue that the evidence had been contaminated or that the storage unit could have been accessed by others, but the prosecution methodically dismantled each argument. Perhaps most damning was the testimony of other victims who came forward once news of Brennan's arrest became public. 3 women, now adults, testified that Brennan had approached them when they were children, attempting to lure them into his vehicle with various pretexts. They had escaped or been frightened away, but they had never forgotten the man who had tried to take them. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts: kidnapping, murder, and abuse of a corpse. The judge sentenced Brennan to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led from the courtroom, Brennan showed no emotion, offering no apology to Sarah's family, no explanation for his actions. In the aftermath of the trial, investigators began the painstaking work of trying to identify the other children in the photographs found in Brennan's storage unit. Several were matched to missing persons cases from the 1980s and 1990s. Some of those cases have since been solved, bringing closure to families who had waited decades for answers. Others remain under investigation. Thomas Mitchell attended every day of the trial, sitting quietly in the gallery, studying the man who had stolen his daughter from him. After the sentencing, he gave a brief statement to the press, thanking Detective Torres, the Millbrook Police Department, and all the investigators who had worked on Sarah's case over the years. He reserved special praise for Detective Holloway, who had died before seeing the case resolved. "James Holloway made a promise to my wife and me in 1994, Thomas said, his voice breaking. He promised he would never give up on finding Sarah. He kept that promise, even after he retired, even when everyone else had moved on. Because of his dedication and the dedication of people like Detective Torres, my daughter can finally rest in peace." Sarah Mitchell's remains were cremated, and her ashes were buried next to her mother in Millbrook Cemetery. The service was attended by hundreds of community members, many of whom had participated in the original search efforts in 1994. They came to pay their respects to a girl they had never stopped thinking about, to mourn the life she never got to live, and to bear witness to the end of a tragedy that had haunted their town for more than 2 decades. Detective Rachel Torres continued working cold cases for the Millbrook Police Department, driven by the knowledge that every unsolved case represented a family still waiting for answers. She kept a photograph on her desk, not of Sarah Mitchell, but of James Holloway standing next to a younger version of himself, a reminder that justice sometimes takes decades, but is always worth pursuing. In the years since the case was solved, Millbrook has slowly healed from the wound that Sarah's disappearance left. The elementary school established a scholarship in her name for students who want to pursue veterinary medicine. The playground where she used to spend recess was renovated and dedicated in her memory. And on October 14 each year, community members gather at the cemetery to lay flowers on her grave and remember the little girl in the yellow raincoat who never made it home. The case of Sarah Mitchell became a cautionary tale about the importance of never closing the door on unsolved crimes, of continuing to apply new technologies to old evidence, of listening to instincts even when they challenge conventional wisdom. It demonstrated that persistence and dedication can overcome even the coldest of trails, that justice delayed is not always justice denied. For Thomas Mitchell, now in his late 70s, the resolution of his daughter's case brought both pain and peace. The pain of knowing exactly how Sarah died, of understanding that she had suffered in her final moments, would never fully fade. But the peace of knowing that her killer was in prison, that Sarah's memory had been honored, that she had not been forgotten, that made it possible to finally, after 23 years, begin to grieve properly. He moved back to Ohio in 2019, not to Millbrook but to a town nearby. He wanted to be close to Sarah's grave, to visit her regularly, to finally have a place where he could talk to his daughter. On warm afternoons, he sits by her headstone and tells her about her mother, about the years that have passed, about how much she was loved and missed, and how many people never stopped looking for her. The yellow raincoat with white polka dots, the stuffed rabbit, and Sarah's drawings were returned to Thomas after the trial concluded. He keeps them in a memory box in his living room, along with photographs of Sarah at various ages. The baby she was, the toddler taking her first steps, the kindergartner on her first day of school, and that final school photograph taken just weeks before she disappeared, forever 7 years old. The Sarah Mitchell case stands as a testament to the thousands of cold cases that remain unsolved across the country, to the families still waiting for answers, and to the investigators who refuse to let those cases be forgotten. It proved that even after decades have passed, even when trails have gone cold and witnesses have died and evidence has degraded, the truth can still emerge. And for one small town in Ohio, it brought closure to a mystery that had defined a generation, allowing a community to finally say goodbye to a little girl who just wanted to go home.